In 1966, on a soundstage in Hollywood, a 26-year-old Bruce Lee was screaming. His feet were dangling in the air. His arms were pinned at his sides. And the man carrying him on his shoulders, like a sack of laundry, was casually walking him around the set of the Green Hornet while the entire crew watched in stunned silence. "Put me down or I'll kill you," Lee shouted. The stuntman holding him didn't break stride. "I can't put you down," he said calmly, "or you'll kill me." This is the story of why a world-class judo champion got called in to humble the future face of martial arts cinema. It's the story of how Bruce Lee had been hurting every stuntman on that set for weeks. And it's the story of what Lee did in the years that followed, when the same stuntmen who came to put him in his place started refusing to share a set with him at all. To understand how Bruce Lee became the most feared man in Hollywood, you have to understand what made that phone call happen. Before he was Kato, before he was an icon, before anyone outside of Hong Kong knew his name, Bruce Lee was a 13-year-old kid getting his ass kicked on the street. He was getting beat up so often, in fact, that his mother enrolled him in Wing Chun training at the school of a master named Yip Man. And from that day forward, Bruce Lee did almost nothing else. By the time he was 15, he was running in street gangs and getting into fights weekly. By 18, he had become such a disruption that his parents shipped him off to America with $100 in his pocket. The story most people know starts there. San Francisco, Seattle, the University of Washington, opening martial arts schools, marrying Linda Emery. But here's what most fans miss. The Bruce Lee who arrived in California was not a polished performer. He was a street fighter, a guy who had spent his teenage years actually hitting people in real fights, not choreographed sequences. And he had zero tolerance for anyone who couldn't keep up. In 1964, Lee gave a martial arts demonstration at the Long Beach Internationals tournament, and in the audience, watching him casually destroy partner after partner with the now famous one-inch punch, was a Hollywood producer named William Dozier. Dozier was working on a new show called The Green Hornet, a comic book adaptation starring Van Williams. He needed a sidekick, someone who could actually fight on camera and make it look real. He found Bruce Lee. But what Dozier didn't realize was that he had just hired the most dangerous man ever to walk onto a Hollywood backlit. When The Green Hornet premiered in September of 1966, audiences expected another superhero series in the style of Batman, which was airing at the time on the same network. Bright colors, goofy villains, POW and BAM cards floating on screen. That's not what they got. The fight scenes on The Green Hornet were unlike anything American television had ever seen. They were fast, they were brutal, and the psychic character named Kato was clearly doing something nobody else on TV could do. The problem was the fight scenes looked too real because they were too real. Stuntmen on the set started getting hurt. Not in big, dramatic ways. In small, accumulating ways. A bruised rib here. A welt across the cheek there. Stiff necks. Sore kidneys, the kind of injuries that pile up over weeks of filming and start to wear a working stuntman down. Stuntmen in 1966 were a specific breed. Most of them were ex-rodeo riders, ex-boxers, or ex-military guys who had drifted into Hollywood looking for steady paychecks. They understood the deal. You take a fall, you sell a punch, you walk away with your insurance card intact. The whole craft was built around making fake violence look real without anyone actually getting hurt. Bruce Lee did not see it that way. According to multiple accounts, including those documented in Matthew Polly's biography Bruce Lee, a life, Lee was simply unable or unwilling to pull his strikes. He believed that if a punch looked real on camera, it needed to actually be real. He kept hitting his fellow stuntmen at full speed, and when they complained, his answer was that they needed to be better at blocking. This was, to put it gently, not how things were done. The stuntmen complained to the stunt coordinator. They complained to the producers. Some of them, by the end, simply refused to work with Lee at all. The man hired to make the fights look great was making it impossible to film them. So the stunt coordinator made a phone call. The stunt coordinator on The Green Hornet was a veteran named Benny Dobbins. Dobbins had been working in Hollywood since the 1950s and had seen every type of performer come and go. Cowboys who couldn't ride. Tough guys who couldn't take a punch. Method actors who insisted on doing their own stunts and broke their ankles doing it. He had never seen anything like Bruce Lee. Dobbins knew what he had on his hands. Lee was the real article, but he was also a liability. If Lee kept hurting stuntmen, the production would fall behind schedule. If the production fell behind schedule, the show would get canceled. And before either of those things could happen, Dobbins needed to send Bruce Lee a message. So Dobbins picked up the phone and called the one person in Los Angeles he knew could deliver that message in a language Lee would understand. His name was Gene LeBell. And to understand why this phone call was the worst news Bruce Lee would receive that year, you need to understand who LeBell actually was. Even hardcore martial arts fans don't really know LeBell's background, so let me lay it out. LeBell was a two-time national AAU judo champion in the United States, taking the title in 1954 and 1955. Back then, judo was virtually unknown in America. To be a national champion in 1954 meant you were one of maybe a dozen people in the entire country who actually knew what they were doing. LeBell also trained at the Kodokan in Tokyo, which is the original headquarters of judo and the source institution for every legitimate judo lineage in the world. Most American practitioners never set foot in the Kodokan. LeBell trained there, repeatedly. In 1963, 3 years before the Green Hornet started filming, LeBell did something that would go almost unrecognized at the time but would later be considered historic. He fought a ranked light heavyweight boxer named Milo Savage in what many martial arts historians now consider the first mixed martial arts fight ever held in the United States. LeBell choked Savage unconscious in the 4th round. He also happened to grow up the son of Aileen Eaton, who was the top boxing and wrestling promoter in Los Angeles for decades. LeBell had been learning chokeholds from professional wrestlers like Ed Strangler Lewis since he was 7 years old. This was the man Benny Dobbins called to handle Bruce Lee. According to LeBell's own account, given decades later in interviews and in his autobiography, Dobbins explained the situation in plain terms. Lee was hurting people. He wouldn't stop. The production was at risk. Would LeBell come down to the set and do something about it? LeBell agreed. He drove to the studio the next day. He had no plan. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He just knew that Bruce Lee needed a wake-up call, and he was going to give it to him. And then he walked onto the set. The exact date is not perfectly documented, but the incident took place during the 1966 production season of The Green Hornet, sometime between the late summer shoots and the fall episodes. When LeBell arrived, Lee was on the set in costume between takes. Dobbins introduced them briefly. LeBell, by his own description, was friendly. He had nothing personally against Bruce Lee. He was just there to do a job. Physically, the two men could not have been more different. Bruce Lee at the time stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed around 135 pounds. He was wiry, ferociously fit, and built like a sprinter. Gene LeBell was 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed approximately 220 pounds of solid grappling muscle, and had the kind of thick, calloused frame that comes from 20 years of throwing other large men onto the ground for sport. The conversation between them was casual at first. They talked about martial arts. They talked about training. And then, when the moment was right and Lee was relaxed and not in a defensive posture, LeBell made his move. He grabbed Bruce Lee. According to LeBell, the way it happened was simple. He stepped in close, slipped under Lee's center of gravity, and lifted him into what wrestlers and judoka call a fireman's carry. Lee's body was hoisted onto LeBell's shoulders, across the back of his neck, with one arm pinned and his legs trailing behind him. And then, with the entire crew of the Green Hornet watching, Gene LeBell started walking. He walked Bruce Lee around the set. He walked him past the lighting rigs. He walked him past the props. He walked him past the stuntmen who, only days before, had been getting hurt by the man now riding on a stranger's shoulders like a piece of luggage. Lee, according to all accounts, was furious. He started making the famous high-pitched sounds he would later become known for in his films. He tried to wriggle free, but because of the angle of the carry, and because of LeBell's grip on his wrist and leg, he could not generate the leverage to escape. "Put me down or I'll kill you," Lee shouted. LeBell didn't break stride. "I can't put you down," he said, "or you'll kill me." LeBell kept walking. He held Lee up there for what he later described as long as I dared. A minute, maybe a little longer. Long enough to make the point. Long enough that every stuntman on the set, every grip, every camera operator saw it happen. And then, finally, LeBell set Bruce Lee back down on the floor. "Hey Bruce," LeBell said, "don't kill me." What happened next is where the legend gets it wrong. Because if Bruce Lee had reacted the way most 26-year-old champion martial artists would react after being publicly humiliated in front of their colleagues, this story would have ended with a fistfight and a lawsuit. That is not what happened. Bruce Lee, after being set down on the floor of the Green Hornet soundstage, walked over to Gene LeBell and asked him a question. He asked LeBell to teach him what he had just done. This single moment is, in many ways, the most important moment of Bruce Lee's entire career, because it reveals something about him that the legend never quite captured. Bruce Lee was not just a great fighter. He was a great student. And the second he was confronted with a technique he didn't know, his ego stepped completely out of the way. Over the following weeks and months, LeBell and Lee trained together regularly. LeBell taught Lee the fundamentals of judo throws, grappling, and ground control. Lee, in exchange, taught LeBell elements of Wing Chun and the trapping techniques he had refined since his Hong Kong days. This is where the martial art known as Jeet Kune Do, which Bruce Lee would formally announce only a few years later, began to take its modern shape. Before the LeBell incident, Lee's fighting style was based almost entirely on striking. Wing Chun for close range, footwork drawn from Western boxing and fencing, kicks adapted from Northern Chinese systems. He had almost no formal grappling. After LeBell, grappling became a core pillar of his system. Lee began studying not just judo but also catch wrestling and Greco-Roman wrestling. He read everything he could find on the subject. He filled notebooks with diagrams of throws and joint locks. The result was that within a year of being humiliated on the Green Hornet set, Bruce Lee had become something that no martial artist in the world had ever quite been before. He was a striker who could grapple, a grappler who could strike, and a fighter who refused to be bound by the rules of any single tradition. If you watch Bruce Lee's films carefully, you can see the influence of LeBell everywhere. In Enter the Dragon, Lee uses a series of arm locks and throws that come directly from judo. In Way of the Dragon, his fight with Chuck Norris ends with a leg lock that no Wing Chun practitioner would ever have used. And in Game of Death, his exchanges with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar include shoulder throws that LeBell himself taught him. LeBell, decades later, would proudly confirm that Bruce Lee used one of his exact submission holds in Enter the Dragon. He would also confirm that the two men became close friends, training partners, and mutual admirers for the rest of Bruce Lee's life. But this is where the story takes its real turn. Because the man who was humbled on the Green Hornet set, the man who got picked up and carried around like a piece of furniture, did not stay humble. He came back hungrier than ever. And the next time Hollywood put a stuntman in front of him, the stuntman did not walk away laughing. In 1969, 3 years after the LeBell incident, Bruce Lee was hired for a small role in a film called Marlowe, starring James Garner as the iconic detective Philip Marlowe. Lee's character was an enforcer named Winslow Wong, hired to threaten Marlowe in his office. The script called for Wong to demonstrate his martial arts skills as a form of intimidation. The director, Paul Bogart, gave Lee the freedom to choreograph the scene himself. What followed was a sequence that left the crew speechless. In a single take, Bruce Lee destroyed Marlowe's office. He shattered desk lamps with kicks. He broke wooden chairs into pieces with his bare hands. He climbed onto the desk, jumped vertically, and performed a high kick that shattered a hanging lamp on the ceiling, 6 feet off the ground. The kick was real. The lamp was real. The destruction was real. According to crew members on set, several Hollywood veterans who had been working in the industry for decades simply walked away from the monitors at the end of the take and said nothing. There was nothing to say. It was, in a very real sense, the first time American audiences would see what Bruce Lee could actually do. 2 years later, in 1971, Lee guest starred in 4 episodes of a detective show called Longstreet, playing a martial arts instructor named Lee Tsung who teaches the blind protagonist how to defend himself. The show's writer and creator, Sterling Siliphant, was actually one of Bruce Lee's private students. Siliphant designed the role specifically to give Lee a platform. The dialogue, including the now famous "Be Water, My Friend" monologue, was drawn directly from Lee's own teachings. By this point, Lee was no longer the rough, untrained brawler the stuntmen of Green Hornet had complained about 5 years earlier. He was a polished, philosophical, and devastatingly skilled performer, and he was about to leave Hollywood entirely. Frustrated by his treatment in the United States, where Warner Brothers had passed him over for the lead role in a TV series called Kung Fu in favor of a white actor named David Carradine, Bruce Lee accepted an offer from a Hong Kong studio called Golden Harvest. In Hong Kong, he was given full creative control. He directed his own films, he choreographed his own fights, and he hired his own stuntmen. According to multiple accounts from the Hong Kong period, including from stuntmen who later worked with Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung, Bruce Lee did not just dominate the local stunt community. He terrified them. The pattern that had started on the Green Hornet, the pattern of fighting too hard and hitting too real, returned with a vengeance. Hong Kong stuntmen who challenged Lee on set, and there were several who tried, were dispatched in seconds. Lee, by this point, was no longer pulling punches because he was unable to. He was choosing not to. One famous account, documented in interviews with Sammo Hung decades later, describes Bruce Lee accepting a challenge from a young stuntman who insisted he could take him. The fight reportedly lasted less than 20 seconds. By 1973, when Bruce Lee was filming what would become his Hollywood breakout, Enter the Dragon, his reputation was such that American stuntmen on the production were openly nervous about working with him. Some of them, according to producer Fred Weintraub, had to be specifically reassured that Lee would not, in fact, kill them during their fight scenes. Bruce Lee died in July of 1973, before Enter the Dragon was released. He was 32 years old. So what is the real story here? It is easy, looking back 50 years later, to mythologize Bruce Lee as a perfect figure who arrived in Hollywood fully formed. The legend has hardened over time into something close to religious. He was the best. He was untouchable. He was a once-in-a-generation talent. All of that is true. But it is also true that on a soundstage in Hollywood in 1966, a 220-pound judo champion picked up a 135-pound Bruce Lee and carried him around like a piece of luggage while he screamed for release. That happened. It is documented. It is part of the record. And the lesson is not that Bruce Lee was vulnerable, though he was. The lesson is what he did with that vulnerability. Most great fighters, when humiliated, either lash out or retreat. They challenge. The person who beat them to a rematch. They hold a grudge. They convince themselves it was a fluke. Bruce Lee did none of those things. He looked at the man who had humbled him, and instead of seeing an enemy, he saw a teacher. He asked questions. He took notes. He spent years incorporating what he had been beaten with into the system he was building. And then he came back, and he was so dangerous that the men who had once been called in to humble him refused to step into the same room. There is a famous concept Lee returned to many times in interviews and in his writings. He called it emptying your cup. The idea that you cannot learn anything new if your mind is already full of what you think you know. In 1966, on the floor of the Green Hornet soundstage, Bruce Lee was forced to empty his cup. He had been so confident in his own abilities that he could not even imagine someone might possess a technique he did not have. Gene LeBell taught him otherwise. And every Bruce Lee fight scene that followed, every twist of a wrist, every shoulder throw, Every joint lock you have seen in Way of the Dragon or Game of Death or Enter the Dragon is the result of that humiliation. The greatest martial artist of the 20th century became great because he was carried around a set like a sack of laundry and chose to learn from it. That is the actual story. If you want to see how Bruce Lee took the same lessons he learned from Jean Labelle and used them in the most famous fight scene of his entire career, his showdown with Chuck Norris in the Coliseum, that video is on screen now. Subscribe for more stories like this one.